The first wolf print at the woven wire skirt of Wade Coyle's carving yard measured 5¾ inches from heel pad to lead toe. He photographed it at sunrise with a tape laid across it and a quarter for scale. Then he stood up, slow, and watched the Malinois at his left hip without turning his head. Ranger was reading the slope above the line cabin. Ears forward, weight low on the haunches, jaw closed. She had not barked. If she had, the night would have gone differently. That is the first thing to understand. When a Belgian Malinois with 30 months on a working dog tab decides not to bark, the threat is something she has already classed as out of immediate range. Whatever made that print had walked past the yard before first light and gone back up to the ridge. The pack would come back. They always come back when they have found a thing worth coming back to. This is a Stillwater County story, late September 2018. The valley is high open country east of the Beartooth Front, sage and bunchgrass, and a thin scatter of lodgepole pine on the north faces. Cow-calf country, not much else. There are wolves now, where in my own youth there were none. The men who run cattle here either learn to live with that or they sell. The man at the center of this story did neither. He built differently. Names I have changed for obvious reasons. The county is real. The wolves are real. The dog is real. Wade had inherited the lease the previous February when Cooper Hollis died of a heart attack on his porch at the age of 47. Hollis had been Wade's team sergeant on an ODA out of Fort Campbell in 5th Special Forces Group. They had gone through the Q course together in the same class in 1991, and they had spent the better part of 3 decades watching each other's back in places Wade does not name on camera and will not name here either. Hollis had retired in 2012 and bought a small spread of bottomland off the East Rosebud, 250 leased head, a carving barn, a 1890s prospector's line cabin on a high pasture lease 3 miles up the drainage, and a working Belgian Malinois named Ranger that he had picked up out of the Lackland K9 program after she washed out of an MWD certification at 22 months for what the paperwork called handler aggression and what Hollis called good judgment about a bad handler. Margaret Hollis had called Wade in the 3rd week of February. Wade was living in a rented single-wide outside of Clarksville at the time, drawing his pension and not much else, and he had not slept more than 4 hours a night since 2016. Margaret asked him whether he would come up and run the place for the season. She could not, she said, do it alone, and she could not sell it either because Cooper had paid down the lease in advance for the year and the cattle were on the ground and the carving was 8 weeks out. She said it the way she said everything, plain and short. Wade drove west the next morning. Ranger was in the passenger seat of his truck by the 2nd day. She had recognized him at the gate by his smell, which had not changed since 2014 when he had last sat at the Hollis kitchen table. She had jumped into the cab without being asked, and she had not got out since. That is the backstory, and the line in this story that runs from one end to the other. There is a man and a working dog and a carving yard high on a Stillwater County lease, and a pack of grey wolves that came down out of the timber for 6 consecutive nights in the 3rd week of September. Everything else moves around that. 6 nights, no shots fired, no losses. By the 7th dawn, the brand inspector for the county was standing at the gate looking at the bottom of the woven wire skirt where the claw marks were, and he had something to say that he had not been planning to say. But first, the wolf print at sunrise. Wade held the photograph up against the wire so I could see the scale when he told me about it later that fall. He said the toes were splayed wide. He said that meant the animal had been moving slow, weight settled, which is what an alpha does when it is mapping a place it intends to come back to. He said Ranger had not barked because Ranger had heard them go up the ridge an hour earlier, and she had already decided that the morning was not the moment. I trust that red. I worked with Shepherds and Malinois at a couple of MWD graduations down at Lackland in the late 90s, on temporary assignment from BUD/S as an outside instructor for water work. And I have not yet met a Malinois off the Lackland line that lied to her handler about a threat. They sometimes get the species wrong, particularly with mountain lions and large dogs at distance, but they do not lie. If Ranger had not barked, the wolves were not yet within the range she classed as immediate. Wade had built the yard in the 4 months between Margaret's phone call and the September of that year. The line cabin itself had been there since 1896, or, to be exact, the lower 3 courses of fieldstone and the original chimney mass had been there since 1896, and the rest had been replaced piecemeal by every owner of the lease for 122 years. The prospector who built the foundation was a man named Egil Knutsen, out of Telemark by way of Anaconda, who had spent the summer of '96 up on the drainage looking for placer gold he never found, and laying fieldstone he did. Wade told me Knutsen's name and the year and the county records on the lease. But on the date of construction, I have only what Wade had, which was a board nailed inside the rafter peak with a date penciled on it and a name. He said it was Egil. It may have been Eric. The pencil had run. What Wade knew when he started, in March, was that the original 1890s footprint of the cabin sat on the high, south-facing bench of a calving pasture that ran 240 acres up against a timber line. He knew there was no fence around the calving lot when he arrived. Cooper had been planning to put one in the spring he died. He knew there were wolves on the drainage. Cooper had said as much on the telephone in November. And he knew the lease ran from the 2nd of March through the 17th of October by way of an AUM agreement on a section and a half of state grazing land, which gave him roughly 7 months of legal cattle presence and required him to defend 250 cow-calf pairs against whatever came down off the ridge. He spent the first 3 weeks of March re-mortaring the south face of the foundation. He used hot lime mortar mixed on a sheet of plywood, the way Hollis had once seen done in a Lithuanian village in 2004. He cured the new joints under wet burlap for 10 days. He worked alone mostly. Ranger sat in the doorway of the cabin and watched the slope above him for the same 10 days, and she watched the road too, and she barked once on the 11th of March at a coyote that had come within 40 yards of the chimney corner and turned around without showing itself, and after that she barked no more for a month. In the 4th week of March, Wade started on what he called the calving yard. I am going to spend a part of the second hour of this story on the engineering of that yard, because the engineering is the point of the whole thing. But for the hook of it, here is the short version. He fenced 1 1/4 acres of dry ground against the south wall of the line cabin with 5-foot woven wire field fence, the kind ranchers call field fence, and the catalogue calls 47-inch fixed knot stay. He set the line posts on 6-foot centres. He buried the bottom of the wire 36 inches below grade, with a 12-inch outward L kick at the base. The wire bent out away from the yard at 90 degrees and pinned with rebar to the underside of the soil. This is the predator-proof skirt. A wolf or coyote that wants to dig in under the fence reaches the bent-out skirt with its forepaws, hits wire, tries to dig deeper, hits more wire, and gives up because the lateral commitment is greater than the meal calculation justifies. He topped the fence with an overhanging top rail at 14 inches of out-of-plumb cantilever, the way you build a chicken yard against a fox or a calving lot against a cougar. The cougar would not come this year. The cougar is part of another story. But Wade builds for cougars in cattle country, whether the season's pressure is cougar or not, because the wire goes in once and stays for 15 years, and the cougar is on a longer clock than the wolves. The men in the valley who saw the yard going in had something to say about it. Most of what they said, in March and in April and in May, was variations on the theme that Wade was overbuilding for a Montana ranching operation that ran on flat wire and barbed wire and posted notices and the occasional Heritage Cooperative sniper rifle on a flatbed when the kills started. Levi Renko, the brand inspector for the Stillwater Sweetgrass District and the man who ran the next operation down the drainage, drove up in his white county Ford on the 11th of April and stood at the gate and watched Wade dig a 36-inch trench with a rented mini excavator and roll wire into it. He said, "You're building a zoo." He said, "Wolves don't dig under field fence, they jump it or they pass it." He said, "Cooper would have laughed." Wade said, "Cooper would have helped." He said it without raising his voice. Renko got back in his truck and drove away. I have known Levi Renko's people for 30 years on and off, from when I was up on the Stillwater with a cut-pole crew in 1984. Renko himself is a hard, fair man by all the accounts I have, and he is what a brand inspector should be in this county. A man who knows every brand and every line of every brand back 4 owners, who knows whose calves come off whose cows by the curl of the ear, who can tell you to the AUM what your lease was last year and what it is this year, and who does not, as a rule, make trouble for ranchers who do not first make trouble for him. He is not a stupid man, but he is a man who has run cattle in this drainage under the rules he learned from his father and his father's father, and he had not yet, that April, lost calves to a wolf pack the way he was about to lose them in September. The cattle came on the lease the 2nd day of May. Cooper had pre-purchased the pairs through a feeder consignment out of Belgrade. The 250 pairs trucked in on 3 loads of cattle pots, dropped at the lower gate, and walked up the drainage to the high pasture under a calm sun. Margaret drove up from the East Rosebud place to watch the unloading. She stood at the gate next to Wade, and she counted heads as they came off the second truck. She said, "Hollis would have liked this morning." Wade said, "He'd have asked you what we were going to do about the wolves." Margaret said, "I asked you that in February." She did not stay long after the cattle were unloaded. She drove the dirt road back down to the East Rosebud, and she did not come back up to the lease until after the September siege, by which point everything had been settled one way or another. That is how Margaret was. She had been a teacher in the Absaraki schools for 30 years, and she did not believe in supervising work she had asked another competent person to do. The first paw print at the woven wire was on the 11th of September. Wade saw it on a perimeter walk at 6 in the morning, in the dust where the wire met the gate on the timber side. It was small, a young wolf, probably an outlier of a larger pack. Ranger went still beside him when she came up to the print and put her nose down. She lifted her head, looked uphill, and waited. Wade looked with her. Nothing showed itself. Aspen leaves were turning above the timberline. The first frost had been the night before. The wolves were running. He thinned the cattle that day. He cut the 80 pairs with the youngest calves out of the larger group and worked them through the gate into the calving lot inside the woven wire fence. The remaining 170 pairs he kept on the high pasture under summer protocol. That is, free-ranging on the AUM section with a daily check at first light and last light, and trust in the herd's own defensive bunching against any predator pressure that did not exceed the herd's capacity to respond. 800 pounds of beef cow with horns and a settled calf is not nothing in front of a 6-wolf pack. Most of the time, the herd is the answer. It is the cut-out calves and the lying-in cows you have to protect. That night, the 11th, the wind dropped to nothing after sundown. The sky cleared. The temperature on Wade's porch thermometer fell to 22 degrees Fahrenheit by 9 o'clock. Wade banked the cook stove low and set Ranger's bed near the south wall, where the warm stone of the chimney ran behind the plaster, and he lay down on the cot with his boots beside the cot and his Mossberg 12-gauge on the kitchen table, loaded with 3 slugs and 4 buckshot in the magazine in alternating sequence, the way Hollis had once told him to load a brush gun in 2007. He did not sleep deep. He had not slept deep since 2016. At 2:17 in the morning, by his account and by the timestamp on Ranger's stomach-mounted vibration alert that he had rigged himself out of a Vibe-tonic dog collar. He is a tinkerer, the rig is not standard. The Malinois came off her bed silent and crossed the cabin floor on 4 pads with no click and no whine, and stood at the south window. Wade watched her without moving. She put her nose against the lower glass. Her tail did not move. Her hackles came up along the shoulder line in a clean ridge. She did not bark. Outside, 200 yards up the slope, a single grey wolf was sitting in the moonlight on a flat patch of dry grass above the timberline, watching the carving yard. Wade saw it through the window from where he lay. He saw the second one 50 yards to the Alpha's right a moment later. He saw the third one 10 seconds after that. He counted, slow. He got to 4. Then he stopped counting because what mattered was not the count, but the formation. They were sitting in a half arc, 4 animals spaced wide across the bench above the timberline. They were not moving toward the yard, they were mapping it. Wade got off the cot slow, and he picked up the Mossberg from the kitchen table, and he stepped to the south window beside Ranger. He did not turn on a light. He did not chamber a round, because the round was already chambered. He stood with the dog beside him, and he watched the wolves watch his yard. He stood like that for 40 minutes. Ranger stood with him. Neither of them moved. The Alpha shifted once at 3 in the morning, lay down on her belly with her head on her paws, and continued to watch. The 4 animals did not advance to within 100 yards of the wire that night. At 4 o'clock by Wade's count, the Alpha rose. The others rose with her. They moved off uphill in a stagger formation, and they were inside the timber within 80 seconds. Ranger held position at the window until 5 minutes after the last animal had disappeared. Then she lay down with her head on her front paws and her eyes on the south window, and she did not close them. Wade made coffee at 5. He drank it standing at the south window with the Mossberg across his lap. At first light, he walked the perimeter of the woven wire, and he found 3 places where the Alpha had come down to within 50 feet of the wire, and stopped and turned and gone back. Ranger walked behind him, head up, working the air. He photographed each set of prints. He noted the time on the back of the photographs in pencil. He wrote in a small leather notebook, September 11th, single yearling print at gate, dust. September 12th, 4 animals on bench, 2:17 to 4 a.m., no advance, Alpha mapped. 6 pages of that notebook fill by the end of the 3rd week of September. I have read the entries. He copied them out for me later, the winter after, when he came down to Tennessee for a visit, and we sat at my kitchen table with the wood stove going and the notebook between us. 6 nights, the first 3 at distance, mapping. The 4th night the pack tested the southeast corner of the wire, and Wade and Ranger held inside the cabin and let the wire do its work. The 5th night was the night the wire was tested at the bottom skirt, and the night the cow with the torn hock went down. The 6th night was the night the question got answered. That is the story I am going to tell. But first, I want to take you back to March and walk you through how he built the yard, because the building of the yard is the answer to why 6 nights of pack pressure on a still water carving lot in September of 2018 ended with 250 pairs intact and 1 cow with a hock cut needing 4 sutures from the country vet, and a brand inspector saying a single sentence at the gate on the 7th dawn that he had not been planning to say. The wire is the story. The wire and the dog and the man who built them both around himself like a third skin, in the months after he lost his team sergeant, in a county he had not lived in until the February of that year, on a lease that was not his, and a Malinois that was not his either, except that she had decided in late February she was his now, and there was no arguing with a Malinois who had decided. We start with the trench. Wade broke the mini excavator on the fourth morning. He was working a 36-inch trench along the south boundary of the carving lot, on a line he had paint-marked the night before in white spray on the dry grass, and the bucket caught a granite boulder the size of a steamer trunk that no one had told him was there. The hydraulic line on the dipper arm gave with a small wet sound. Fluid sprayed across the cab. The bucket settled into the trench at an angle, halfway through what would have been the day's 140 feet of new wire run, and stopped. He sat in the cab for a while, with the engine off and the smell of hydraulic fluid coming up through the floorboards. Ranger sat 10 feet away in the dry grass watching him. She had been watching him for 19 days by then, since he had got off the truck at the lower gate on the 2nd of March, with a duffel bag and a rifle case, and a single piece of paper from Margaret with the AUM lease number written on it. And in those 19 days, the dog had concluded what she had concluded about him, which was that he was the next handler, and that she was going to keep him alive, whether he wanted her to or not. He climbed out of the cab, and he stood beside the bucket, and he looked at the boulder. He said, out loud, to no one in particular, "You are not a piece of equipment Cooper bought." Then he laughed, one short laugh with no humour in it, and he walked the half-mile back to the cabin with Ranger on his hip, and he sat on the porch step with his hands hanging between his knees for the better part of an hour. I want to say one thing about that hour. I have been on porch steps like that. Most men who have done the work Wade did before he came up to the Stillwater have been on porch steps like that. The work does not always set you down where you expect it to. Cooper Hollis had been the steadier of the two of them, by every account I have including Wade's, and Cooper Hollis was the one who had died in his porch chair in February, at 47 years of age, while reading a feeder report and drinking a cup of coffee with cream in it. There is no fair distribution of that arithmetic. There is only what you do on the porch step, and how long it takes you to stand up. Wade stood up at the 43rd minute, by his recollection, and he walked back to the trench, and he disconnected the broken hydraulic line, and he wrapped the seal in baling wire to keep the bucket from dropping, and he winched the bucket out of the trench with a come-along set against a dead man log he buried in the hardpan 20 feet off the line. Then he drove the broken excavator the 4 miles down the drainage to the equipment dealer in Absaraki, paid for the line, paid for the boom arm seal, paid the dealer's man $100 to deliver the patched machine back up to the lease the next morning, and drove the 4 miles home with Ranger on the seat beside him. That night, by lamplight at the kitchen table, he sat down and recalculated the trench plan. He had thought he was going to dig the full perimeter of the carving lot, 440 feet of trench, with the rented excavator in 5 working days. He now had 3 days. He had to give the dealer's man back the machine on the morning of the 8th, or pay an additional rental week. He could either run the trench shallow and call it good, which is what the standard cattle country installation called for, and what Renko's father had taught Renko and the rest of the valley to call sufficient, or he could go deep on the south side and the east side, where the timber line was close, and shallow on the west and the north, where the timber stood far back, and call the difference the cost of doing the job right. He went deep on south and east. He went shallow on north and west. That is the first decision the yard turned on. Anybody who has worked predator pressure on cattle in the northern Rockies will tell you that you build for the line the predator comes from, not for the line he could in theory come from. Wolves on the Stillwater East Rosebud drainage come down out of the timber on the south face, and they hold to the timber line until they can swing east around the bench. They do not come across the open north pasture, The open ground gives them no cover, and they will not commit. Wade saved the work he was not going to need, and he put it where he was going to need it. The second decision was the bottom kick. The catalogue cut for a 47-inch fixed knot stay sells the wire to fence yards in 5-strand height, with 2-inch top spacing and 6-inch bottom spacing, and the standard installation puts the wire on the ground or 3 to 4 inches into the soil. That is enough for cattle. It is not enough for canids. A coyote will dig out a 4-inch burial in 12 minutes. A grey wolf, working a denning instinct against a familiar livestock target, will dig out a 12-inch burial in under 30. Wade did not know the wolf numbers when he started. He knew the coyote numbers from Vermont in the early 2000s, where he had done a season of nuisance control contracting between deployments, and he extrapolated. He chose 36 inches of vertical burial and a 12-inch outward L kick at the base, on the theory that a wolf with her front paws on bent-out wire and her chest pressed flat to bare ground would not commit to a meal that required her to dig a 36-inch shaft and then crawl along a foot of horizontal wire to come up inside the yard. The theory turned on the wolf's effort versus reward calculus, not on the wire's mechanical strength. The wire would hold against the dig. The question was whether the dig would be attempted. It was. We will get to that. But the theory held. The third decision was the top rail. He cantilevered 14 inches of barbless top wire outward on welded pipe brackets, the way the Wyoming sheepmen had been doing it against mountain lions on lambing lots since the 1940s. The wolves were not the climbers. The wolves were the diggers. The top rail was insurance against the cat that he knew lived on the drainage, and that Cooper had once seen at 50 feet on a glassing trip in 2015, a mountain lion, female, with a half-grown kitten, and that Wade was not going to wait around to discover the schedule of. In the 4th week of March, with the trench dug and the wire on the way from the co-op in Billings, an old man walked up the Lease Road on foot from the lower county road and stopped at Wade's gate. He was somewhere past 70. He wore a Carhartt jacket gone grey at the cuffs and a brown felt Stetson with a crease across the crown that I happen to know is the working crease of a man who has slept on his hat in a horse camp more nights than he has slept on a pillow. He carried a thermos. He said his name was Joseph Plainbull and that he ran a small bunch of pears on a crow allotment over east, on family ground he leased back from the tribe. Wade said he had heard of him from Margaret. Joseph said that Margaret had mentioned Wade was up here doing things. Wade said that was about right. Joseph asked whether Wade had a few minutes for a man to drink coffee on the porch. Wade said he did. They sat for an hour, neither of them saying much. Ranger lay at Joseph's left boot the whole time, which is a thing Ranger did not do for visitors as a general rule. Joseph noticed it and did not comment. After about 40 minutes he stood up and walked the line of the partly dug trench from the south corner to the east corner. Slow, with his hat off, looking at the depth and at the bottom width and at the small line of pipe brackets Wade had laid out on a tarp for the top rail. He came back to the porch and he said one thing. He said, "My grandfather built a horse yard on the Bighorn in 1931 to keep wolves off his foals. He went 30 inches down and 10 inches sideways. He lost no foals for 21 winters. They did not stop coming. They stopped trying." Wade nodded once. Joseph put his hat back on. He walked back down the Lease Road. Wade stood on the porch and watched him go. Ranger watched him go too, and then she came back inside the cabin and lay down by the cook stove. She had concluded something about Joseph Plainbull. I have concluded things about him too. I have only met him once, in the spring of 2020, when I came out to the lease to see Wade and the yard for myself. And what I concluded about Joseph in the 45 minutes we sat at the table together was that he was the kind of man whose 45 minutes of company can change a hard week into a better week, and his grandfather may have known more about wolf pressure on a working horse band on the Big Horn in the 1930s than anyone alive now in this state knows about wolves on cattle in the present age. That information is leaving us. Joseph carries some of it. Wade now carries some of it. The notebook on the kitchen table is one more place it is held against the wind. The wire came in on the 2nd of April, 4 spools of 50 rods each, dropped at the lower gate by the co-op truck. Wade and Ranger drove the spools up the lease road on the back of the pickup and unloaded them one at a time at 400-foot intervals along the line of the trench. He spent the next 11 days setting line posts on 6-foot centers. The posts were 10-foot treated pine, set 4 feet deep on the south and east lines and 3 feet on the north and west, tamped with crushed road base. The corner braces were full H braces with diagonal compression rails, the way you brace a fence that has to hold against pressure and not just stand against gravity. Anybody who has watched a 4-strand barbed wire corner fail in a wet spring on a Rocky Mountain hillside knows why an H-brace matters. The wire went into the trench in the 3rd week of April. He rolled it out flat along the trench line, bent the bottom 12 inches outward at 90 degrees with a hand jig he had welded from scrap angle iron in a borrowed shop in Absaroki, pinned the L with rebar staples driven through every 4th wire on the horizontal foot, and backfilled the trench with the original soil compacted in 6-inch lifts. The compaction is the part most ranchers skip. Loose soil over a buried L-skirt collapses in the first heavy rain and gives the predator a starting depression to dig in. Compacted soil at 6-inch lifts is no easier to dig than the surrounding hardpan, and it holds the L-skirt at depth for the life of the wire. He hung the woven wire field fence on the posts on the south and east lines first, then the north and west, then the top rail brackets and the cantilevered top wire. He set the gate posts last, 12-inch treated rounds buried 6 feet on a concrete plug, with a galvanized farm gate 16 feet wide and a smaller man gate on a separate hinge. The gate was the weak point in any predator fence, and he knew it. He hung the man gate so that it could be barred from inside the cabin with a single drop bolt, in case he ever had to drop the bolt in the dark, with a Malinois already through the gate ahead of him. He finished the wire on the 11th of May. He stood inside the yard at the end of that day, with Ranger sitting at his hip, and he walked the inside perimeter from the southeast corner all the way around to the gate, and he stopped at 3 places where the wire ran less true than he wanted it. At each of those 3 places, the next morning, he restrung the wire between the posts with a tensioning come-along and re-anchored the brackets. By the 14th, the yard was tight enough that you could put a tennis ball against the wire, and the wire would not give an inch in either direction. I have seen the photograph of that yard. The wire is true. The man who built it knew what he was building. Levi Renko drove up in the white county Ford on the morning of the 15th. He sat in the truck for a moment, with the engine off, looking at the yard. Then he got out and stood at the gate and worked a piece of jerky from a tin in his shirt pocket. Wade and Ranger came down off the porch to meet him. Renko said, "You spent how much on this?" Wade told him. Renko said, "I could have done it for half." Wade said, "You'd have gone 4 inches deep." Renko said, 4 inches is what the catalogue says. The catalogue's the catalogue for a reason." He chewed the jerky. He said, "I know my fences." Wade said, "I'm not arguing about your fences. I'm not building yours." Renko looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at Ranger, who was sitting on Wade's left and watching Renko the way a Malinois off the Lackland line watches a stranger at a wire gate, which is to say, with her weight balanced over her front feet and her tongue inside her mouth. Renko said, "You ever lose a head on this lease, you call me before you call anyone else. That's how it works in this drainage." Wade said, "I will." Renko said, "And I'll tell you what I think your wire's worth at that point, not before." Wade said, "Fair enough." Renko got back in the truck and drove away. From the middle of May until the second week of September, Wade ran the herd up onto the high pasture under summer protocol. He worked. He slept some. He did not sleep much. Margaret called from Upsaraki on a Sunday in late June and asked whether Wade was eating, and Wade said he was eating fine, and Margaret said she was driving up the following Sunday with a casserole and a pie, and Wade said he would be on the porch. She came up. She brought the casserole and the pie. She sat with Wade and Ranger on the porch through the better part of an afternoon, and she told Wade what she had not told him in February, which was that Cooper had been sitting in his porch chair when he died. She had been inside making coffee. She had heard the coffee cup hit the porch boards before she had heard anything else. She had come out, and Cooper was already gone. She said it the way she said everything, plain and short, with no extra weight on any of the words. But her hands were folded tight in her lap when she said it, and she did not look at Wade until she had finished saying it. Wade did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Margaret, Cooper would have wanted you to keep this lease. Not me. You." Margaret said, "I know what Cooper wanted. He wanted me to keep teaching. He wanted you to run this place. He told me both in the same week in October. He had a feeling. He didn't say what kind of feeling, but he had it." Wade looked at her. He did not know what to do with that. Most men would not have known what to do with that. After a while he said, "All right." Margaret said, "All right." She stayed another 40 minutes, and then she drove down the drainage to the East Rosebud and home. Ranger watched her truck go all the way to the lower gate. I have thought about that afternoon a fair amount in the years since I first heard about it. There is a thing that happens to men who have spent 30 years in a small profession together. You think you know who is the steady one and who is the one who needs the steady one. Then one of you dies in a porch chair at 47, and the other one drives west in February with a duffel bag, and the surviving man finds out that the dead man had been thinking, in the last months of his life, about what was going to be left for the surviving man to do. And the dead man had made arrangements. And the dead man's wife had been carrying those arrangements alone for 4 months before she said anything about them, because that was the kind of woman she was, and because she had not been sure until April whether the surviving man was going to be able to run the lease, and by April she had concluded he was going to be able to. Most of what passes for friendship in this country is shallower than that. I have not built a yard like Wade's yard. I have not been asked to, but I know what it took out of him to be asked, and I know what the asking gave him back, which was a use for himself that did not depend on anyone but a Malinois and a carving herd and a wire he was building correctly. A man on a porch step at the 43rd minute does not always stand up. Wade did. The yard is the proof he stood up. The cattle came on the 2nd of May, as I said before. The 80 cow-calf pairs went into the calving lot inside the woven wire on the 11th of September, as I said before. In between those 2 dates, the yard sat empty against the south wall of the cabin, and the grass inside it grew untouched, and the wire held its tension, and the wolves came no closer to the lease than the high timber on the south face, where they were heard from time to time, but not seen. Wade walked the perimeter every morning at first light with Ranger, and again every evening at last light, and the dog read the air on those walks the way a dog reads air, and her hackles came up twice in August on the southeast corner, and both times nothing showed itself, and the air settled back, and the wolves were where they were, and Wade and Ranger walked back to the cabin. He cleaned the Mossberg twice a month. He cleaned the single-action Colt that hung on a hook by the cabin door, more out of habit than out of any expectation that he would ever use it. The Colt was a Cooper gun, a wedding anniversary present from Margaret in 1999, and Margaret had asked him to take it up to the cabin in March because she did not want it in the East Rosebud house, and Wade had said yes, and he had not taken it down from the hook since he had hung it up. He cleaned the brush hook he used to keep the timber edge cut back from the south wire. He oiled the gate hinges. He repacked the bearings on the watering trough pump. These are the things you do in a carving operation in a Stillwater County summer when the threat has not yet arrived. You do the small work. You keep the iron tight. You walk the wire at first light and last light. And you watch the dog, because the dog is the alarm system that does not ever go down for maintenance and does not ever need to be rebooted in October. On the 10th of September, the night before the first paw print appeared, Ranger came off her bed at 3 in the morning and stood at the south window for 11 minutes. Wade got up and stood with her. Nothing showed itself. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The moon was a thin crescent low in the west. Ranger lay down again at 3:11, and Wade went back to the cot. The next morning he walked the wire, and he found the print at the gate. The yard by then was ready. On the third night, Ranger came off her bed at 1:12 in the morning, and she did bark. It was not the kind of bark a Malinois off the Lackland line offers up casually. It was one short, dense, cut-off note that came up out of her chest like a piece of dropped iron and did not repeat. Wade was on his feet inside 2 seconds, with the Mossberg in his right hand and his boots in his left, and he was at the south window before the bark had finished echoing off the chimney mass. Outside, on the bench above the timberline, the pack was moving. There were 5 of them now, not 4. He counted them twice and got the same number, and then he watched them, and he counted by formation a third time and confirmed 5. The 5th animal had come down off the upper drainage to join the original 4. It was the largest of the 5, larger than the alpha he had been calling the alpha, larger across the chest and in the shoulder ridge, and it was walking in the rear of the formation in a way that told Wade he had been wrong on the first night about which animal was running the pack. The big one in the back was the alpha. The 4 in front were the working order. I want to take a moment on what Wade saw, because most people who have not lived with wolf pressure on cattle have the mental picture wrong. The picture in most heads is a wedge of dark shapes running across snow at a herd, a chase scene, teeth and dust. The reality of a pack mapping a fenced calving lot at 1:12 in the morning in mid-September on a Stillwater County bench with a half moon and no wind is much closer to a small group of dancers practicing a piece they have already rehearsed somewhere else. They moved at a fast walk, never a run, and they tested angles. One animal would drift wide of the formation by 20 yards, hold there for 15 seconds, and drift back. Another would slip down toward the wire at the southeast corner, stop at 60 feet, hold for 30 seconds, and return to formation. The big animal in the back never moved fast. It stood, or it walked at a deliberate pace, and it watched the others work. Wade stood at the south window with the Mossberg across his forearm and the safety on, and Ranger pressed against his left thigh and her hackles up in a ridge that ran from her crown to her tail base. She did not bark again. The single bark had been her notification to him, the way she had been trained at Lackland to give a single notification on a discovered presence and then go silent and watch. At 1:27, the southeast corner animal, a slim grey, 2 or 3 years old by the build, came down to within 40 feet of the wire and stopped. It put its nose down. It worked the air. It put its nose to the soil. It dug, once, a single quick scrape with its right front paw. 8 inches of soil scattered behind it. It looked up at the cabin. It held that look for what Wade later told me felt like a full minute and was probably 11 or 12 seconds. Then it turned and rejoined the formation. That was the fourth night. I want to put a finer point on what just happened than Wade did when he told me the story. The wolf had scraped the soil 8 inches from the wire. It had not scraped at the wire, it had scraped to see whether the ground was diggable. A wolf working a familiar livestock target with the intent to penetrate does not approach the barrier first. It approaches the ground next to the barrier and it makes an evaluation. Wade had buried the L-skirt 3 feet under that ground. The wolf had no way to know the L-skirt was there at 3 feet because it had only scratched the surface 8 inches out from the wire. What the wolf knew from the 8-inch scratch was that the ground was dry hardpan and that any commitment to digging would be expensive in foot-pounds of effort. It went back to formation to discuss the situation with the alpha. I am saying discuss because that is what wolves do. They do not vocalize the way humans vocalize. They move close to one another. They put noses on one another's necks. They orient bodies. The 4 animals in the front, working order, returned to the alpha, and they oriented around her in a loose half-circle, and they stood there for the better part of 2 minutes, and at 1:32 the formation reformed, and they moved off uphill into the timber, and the bench was empty again. Ranger held position at the window until 1:40. Wade held position with her. Then she lay down in her bed by the south wall, and she put her head on her paws, and she watched the window. Wade lay down on the cot, fully dressed, with the Mossberg across his chest. He did not sleep. The pack would be back the next night, he was certain of it, and the next night was the night the L-skirt would either work or fail, and there was no point thinking about anything else until that question was answered. On the morning of the 14th, he photographed the 8-inch scratch, and he noted it in the leather notebook. September 14th, 1:12. 5 animals on bench, alpha confirmed as larger trailing female. Southeast, subordinate scratched ground at 40 feet from wire, 8 inches deep. No further advance. He copied the entry into a second small notebook he had started for the purpose of writing things down twice, once in the field book and once in a duplicate, on the chance that a notebook might be lost. Hollis had taught him to do that with operational notes in 1993 on the Q course. He had not stopped doing it since. At 7 in the morning, he drove down the Lease Road and he turned south on the county pavement, and he passed Renko's lower gate at 7:15. Renko's white county Ford was parked at the gate with the driver's door open, and Renko himself was on his knees in the dirt of the gate apron, with one hand on the haunch of a cow that was not standing up. Wade stopped. He got out. Ranger came out behind him. The cow had been hamstrung. Both rear tendons on the left leg had been opened with a clean lateral bite at the gaskin. The cow was on her side, breathing hard. The bite signature was wolf, not coyote. Coyotes work the throat or the calf, not the gaskin, and the depth of the puncture was consistent with the canine spread of an adult grey wolf. Renko looked up at Wade. His face was the colour of cold ash. He said, "2 calves gone in the night. This cow won't get up." Wade said, "Where did you find her?" Renko said, "Lower pasture, 300 yards from the road. She got herself this far on her front legs before she went down." Wade looked at the calves Renko had laid in the back of the Ford on a sheet of canvas. 2 heifer calves, 6 months old, 80 pounds each. The kills were clean throat and flank work, no waste, the way a pack feeds when it has the time and the safety. They had been opened and partially fed on, and then dragged through the wet grass to a small swale 100 yards off the cow's track, where the rest of the carcass and the offal still lay. Renko had collected what he could. He was going to call the State Predator Management Officer at 8 when the office opened, and then the calf carcasses would be photographed and weighed, and the case would go on the federal compensation file that paid out roughly 70% of market value 6 to 9 months after the kill confirmation if the paperwork was filed correctly. Wade and Renko stood together at the back of the truck for a while without speaking. Then Renko said, "Yours got hit too." Wade said, "No." Renko looked at him. He said, "Were they up there?" Wade said, "5 animals on the bench above my carving yard at 1:12 this morning. They mapped it for 20 minutes. The southeast subordinates scratched at the ground 40 feet out from my wire, and then they all went home." Renko was quiet for a while. He said, "I should have run wire." Wade said, "You can still run wire. I've got the trench jig in my shop. I've got 50 rods of stay wire I didn't use. You want it, you can have it. I'll dig the trench with you on Saturday." Renko looked at the cow. He looked at the calves in the bed of the truck. He looked at Wade. He said, "I have to put this cow down. Will you help me with that?" Wade said, "I will." They did. Wade went back to his truck and got a .38 from the glove box, and they put the cow down in the gate apron, and they pulled her over with a chain off the front bumper of the Ford and laid her under the cottonwood at the gate. And Renko called the rendering truck out of Billings, and then he called the state predator officer at 5 after 8. Wade stayed with him through both phone calls. The state officer said he would be out by noon. The rendering truck would not arrive until late afternoon. Wade drove back up the lease road at 9. Ranger was on the passenger seat next to him, looking out the window. She had not made a sound during the work at Renko's gate. She had stood at Wade's left through the calls and through the dispatch of the cow and through the chaining, and she had watched everything, and she had not made a sound. I tell you this because there are people who think a working dog of that breed cannot hold still through that kind of work. They can. The ones off the Lackland line will hold still through worse than that. They will hold still through their handler bleeding out if the handler tells them with a hand signal to hold still, which is one of the harder things to teach, and which Hollis had taught Ranger himself in 2013 on the East Rosebud place with a piece of beef heart and a pocket clicker. That afternoon, Wade did 3 things. He fed the 80 pairs inside the calving yard with a square bale he forked over the gate. He walked the north and west pasture and accounted for the 170 free-ranging pairs by sight and by tag number. He drove down to Joseph Plain Bull's place, east of the lease, and he sat at Joseph's kitchen table for an hour and a half, and he asked Joseph one question. The question was, when your grandfather's horse yard was tested, what did the test look like? Joseph poured the coffee. He said, on the 3rd night of pressure, the pack came down inside 50 feet of the wire, and one of them dug. He did not break through. He did not get under. He scratched and he stopped. They went back. On the 5th night, they tested the wire itself. They put their weight against it in 3 places to see if it would give. It did not give. They went back. On the 7th night, they did not come. Wade said, and the foals? Joseph said, all the foals lived. Wade said, what did your grandfather do during the test of the wire? Joseph said, he sat on the porch with a rifle and he did not fire. Wade nodded. Joseph said, the dog he had was a McNab. It barked once at the first arrival and then it watched. It did not bark again until the pack was gone. Wade said, mine is a Malinois. She did the same. Joseph said, good breeding will run across breed lines that way. He poured more coffee. He said, if you want company tonight, I will come up. Wade said, thank you, I will be all right. The dog is enough. Joseph said, the dog is always enough if she is the right dog, but 2 old men on a porch sometimes settle a herd faster than one. Wade smiled. He said, maybe on the 5th night. Joseph said, maybe on the 5th. Wade drove back up the lease road at 4 in the afternoon. He banked the cook stove fire. He cleaned the Mossberg again, although it did not need cleaning. He fed Ranger early, and he ate a tin of beans standing at the kitchen counter, and he sat on the porch in the late afternoon light and watched the south slope where the timber came down to the bench. There was no wind. The aspens above the timberline were yellow. The lower bunch grass was dry and pale. A single mule deer doe crossed the bench at 5 and disappeared into the timber to the east. Ranger watched her cross and did not move. At 10 that night, Wade lay down on the cot with the Mossberg on the table beside him, and Ranger lay in her bed by the south wall, and the cabin was quiet. At 12:44 in the morning, Ranger came off her bed without a sound, and she stood at the south window, and her hackles came up the way they had come up the night before, except this time she did not bark, and she did not turn her head to Wade. She stood still, and she watched. Wade was at her shoulder inside 5 seconds. The pack was on the bench again, 5 animals, the alpha at the rear, the 4 in working order, spaced wide. They moved at the deliberate walk Wade had seen on the 4th night, but this time they moved closer. The southeast subordinate that had scratched the ground the night before came down to within 20 feet of the wire at the southeast corner and stopped. 2 more animals came down to within 30 feet on either side of him. The 4th front animal was working the southwest corner. The alpha held the bench at 100 yards. The southeast subordinate dug. It was not the 8-inch test scratch of the night before. It was a working dig. The wolf put its chest down and its haunches up, and it drove with both front paws at the soil tight against the wire, and it threw soil behind it in a steady arc for 19 seconds. Wade timed it on his watch. At the end of the 19 seconds, the wolf stopped, lifted its head, and looked at the alpha. The alpha had not moved. The wolf put its head back down and dug for another 14 seconds. At the end of the second push, the wolf hit the L-skirt at depth. Wade saw the moment. The wolf's front paws hit wire at what was probably 18 or 20 inches of depth, where the L had begun to bend outward, and the wolf hesitated. It pulled its head back. It looked at the wire under its paws. It dug to its right, lateral, for 4 seconds. It hit more wire. It dug to its left, lateral, for 3 seconds. It hit more wire. It put its head down into the hole, and it tried to bite the wire. Once, and it gave that up immediately, because a grey wolf's bite on cold galvanized wire is a thing that hurts a wolf's mouth. It backed out of the hole. It stood. It looked at the alpha. The alpha had not moved. The alpha came down off the bench at a walk. She crossed the open ground to within 15 feet of the southeast corner, and she stopped, and she watched the hole the subordinate had dug. She did not put her nose down. She lifted her head, and she looked at the cabin. She held that look. Wade looked back at her through the south window. He did not move. Ranger did not move. The cow on the East Rosebud lower pasture, 12 hours earlier, had been killed by an animal that was now standing 15 feet from his wire and looking at his cabin. The alpha held the look for 41 seconds. Wade timed it. Then she turned. She walked back uphill. The 4 subordinates followed her in formation. They were inside the timber within 2 minutes. Wade stood at the window for another 20 minutes after they had gone. Ranger stood with him. Then he set the Mossberg on the kitchen table, and he sat down in the kitchen chair, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at his hands for a while. They were not shaking. They had not shaken since 2016. But there was a particular weight in his chest that he had felt before in his career, twice, in 2 specific places he is not going to name on this account. And he sat with that weight for the better part of an hour before he stood up and walked out to the carving yard with a flashlight and Ranger at his hip. The hole at the southeast corner was 18 inches deep at the deepest point. The L-skirt was scratched bright at the edge where the wolf had hit it. There was a small pool of saliva at the lip of the hole where the wolf had tried to bite the wire. There was no breach. The wire had held. He walked the inside of the carving yard, slow with the flashlight. The 80 pairs were bunched at the center of the lot, tight, the way cattle bunch when they have heard something they do not like. The cow with the torn hock was at the edge of the bunch on the south side. He went closer. She had cut herself somehow during the bunching. The cut was on the inside of her left rear hock, 4 inches long, clean-edged. Not a wolf bite, not a coyote bite. He looked at her, and he looked at the soil under her feet, and he found what had cut her. It was a 16-penny nail, bent, deformed, half buried in the dry soil at the southeast corner of the inside fence. It was a nail that had been there for some time, probably driven into the original 1890s corner post by Egil Knutsen in the summer he laid the foundation, and rusted out and fallen and worked its way to the surface over 122 years, and surfaced now in the dry grass at the exact moment a cow needed somewhere to stand and chose that piece of ground. The cow had stepped on it sideways, and the bent shank had opened the hock from the inside. He picked the nail out of the soil with his fingers. He held it in the flashlight beam. He said, quiet, to Ranger and to no one else, "Egil, you son of a bitch." He carried the cow back to the carving barn on her own 4 feet, slow, with his hand on her shoulder and Ranger circling at a respectful distance. He laid her down on clean straw inside the barn, and he packed the cut with gauze from the first aid kit, and he taped the gauze with vet wrap. He would call Dr. Stratton from the country veterinary in Upsaraki in the morning. The cow would need 4 sutures and a course of antibiotics and 3 days of barn rest, but the cow would live and the calf would live, and on the 7th day she would walk back out into the carving yard on her own legs. That was the 5th night. The alpha had stood at 15 feet from the wire, and the wire had held, and the cow had cut herself on a 122-year-old nail. Wade sat in the carving barn beside the cow until first light. Ranger lay at the door of the barn and watched the south slope. At dawn, he drove down to Joseph Plainbull's place. Joseph was already on the porch with the coffee made. Wade told him about the dig and the alpha's look and the cow and the nail. Joseph listened. When Wade finished, Joseph said, "On the 7th night they will not come. They do not come on the 7th night. My grandfather wrote that down too." Wade said, "What about the 6th? Joseph said, "The 6th is the night you find out what kind of yard you built." Wade nodded. He drank his coffee. Joseph said, "I will come up at 6 o'clock this evening." Wade said, "All right." The drive back up the Lease Road in the late September light was the slowest drive Wade had taken since February. Ranger watched the slope the entire way. Joseph came up the Lease Road at 6 o'clock with the last of the sun on the timber to the south. He drove an old Ford F250 with a bale of hay and a saddle on the back and a stock rifle in the rear window. He pulled in beside Wade's truck and got out and walked up to the porch with the thermos and a covered plate. The plate had a venison stew on it. He had brought enough for 2 men and 1 Malinois. Ranger met him at the porch steps and pressed her shoulder against his thigh, which was a thing Ranger did not do for anyone except Wade and Margaret. Joseph put his hand on her head briefly and said something in Crow that I could not get him to translate for me later, although he smiled when I asked. The 2 men ate at the kitchen table. They did not say much. Joseph had brought his own coffee in the thermos because he did not like the way Wade made coffee, and after the stew was finished, Joseph poured 2 cups of his own coffee, and they sat at the table with the lamp on and the cabin warm and Ranger lying across the threshold of the south door. Joseph said after a while, "My grandfather sat with the rifle on the porch on the 6th night because he had decided the wire alone might not hold. He did not fire, but he sat with the rifle in his hands the entire night. He told my father that he sat with the rifle in his hands because what he was protecting was not just the horses, it was the work he had done. He had built a yard, and he wanted to know whether his yard was the kind of yard a wolf would beat. So he sat with the rifle, so that if the yard was the kind of yard a wolf would beat, the rifle would not be the wolf's idea of last resort, but the yard's." Wade said, "I am going to sit with the Mossberg the same way." Joseph said, "I thought you would." They put on their coats at 11. Wade carried the Mossberg. Joseph carried his stock rifle, an old Winchester Model 70 in 30-06 that had belonged to his father. They went out to the porch, and they pulled the 2 porch chairs back into the shadow of the eave, where they would not be silhouetted against the lamplight from inside the cabin if anything looked toward the cabin from the bench. Joseph said something about not skylining your hide. He said it the way an old man says a thing he has said 100 times before. Wade nodded. The cabin lamp went out at 11:05. Wade had turned it off from inside before he came out. Ranger came out behind him and lay down between the 2 men on the porch boards, her head turned to face the south bench, her ears working slow and forward. The night was cold, 26 on the porch thermometer. A high, thin overcast had moved in during the late afternoon, and the moon was somewhere behind it, giving a flat grey light over the bench and the timber. There was a breath of wind moving up the drainage from the south, no more than 3 or 4 miles an hour. The wind carried the smell of bunch grass and of cattle, and faintly, very faintly, of something else, which was the smell that for 2,000 years has told men sitting on porches at night that the wolves are downwind and you are upwind, and that the wolves know it, and so do you. At 12:17, Wade noted the time on the back of his wristwatch by feel because he could not raise the watch face to see it without moving the rifle. Ranger lifted her head. She did not move otherwise. Her chin came up off her paws by perhaps 2 inches, and her ears came forward and her nostrils opened. She had got the wind. Joseph said, very quiet beside Wade, "She has them." Wade said, "How many?" Joseph said, "I do not know. The dog will tell us." For 7 minutes Ranger held that position. Her chin came down again at 12:24, and her ears did not go back. They stayed forward. Her breathing did not change. She was tracking by scent alone now. Whatever was on the slope had not yet shown itself to her sight. At 12:29, 3 animals came down off the bench. I want to say something here about what Wade said to me later about that moment, because it bears on the larger thing the story is about. He said that he had not been frightened when he first saw the animals. He had been doing the calculation. He had felt the calculation move forward in his chest, the way it had moved forward at 3 or 4 moments in his career, when the calculation had been more urgent and the answer more terminal. He said the calculation was, where is the alpha? Where is Ranger? Where is the wire? What is the angle of fire from this porch, if it comes to fire? What is Joseph's position? What is Joseph's angle? Where is the man gate? Where is the carving barn? Where is the cow with the torn hock? He said the calculation came up and resolved itself in about 3 seconds, and then it sat there, waiting for new inputs. He said, "It is not heroic. It is just what you do. You spend 26 years doing it, and your chest does it before your head does it. The hard part is afterwards, when your chest goes back to ordinary and you remember that you are tired." The 3 animals on the bench were the 3 working subordinates. The 4th subordinate was not visible. The alpha was not visible. The 3 came down to the southeast corner of the wire. the same corner the subordinate had dug at on the 5th night. They stopped at 12 feet. They did not put their noses down. They held position in a triangle, 3 points evenly spaced, watching the corner. Joseph breathed in and out slow beside Wade. He said, "They are doing something I have not seen." Wade said, "What?" Joseph said, "They are waiting." Ranger had begun to shake, not with fear, with the held tension of a working dog who has been ordered to stay and who is calculating, exactly the way her handler is calculating, where she would go if the order to stay were lifted. Her front paws were splayed wide on the porch boards. Her hindquarters were gathered. She had not made a sound. At 12:33, the 4th subordinate came down off the bench at a run. It came in from the west, at a hard angle, not at the southeast corner where the other 3 were holding, but at the southwest corner where the wire turned. It came at full pack speed, low, head extended, and it hit the southwest corner without stopping, and it tried to vault the wire. It got 2 front paws on the cantilevered top rail, and the cantilever held. The wolf's chest hit the rail. The wolf's body weight loaded the cantilever from above. The bracket flexed and did not give. The wolf hung for a fraction of a second on the rail, with its weight forward and its hindquarters fighting for purchase. And then the cantilever spilled it back outside the wire, and it landed on its side in the dust. It got up. It tried again. It hit the rail with both front paws, and the same thing happened. Then the alpha came down off the bench. She came down at a walk, the way she had come down on the 5th night. She came straight to the southeast corner of the wire, where the 3 subordinates were waiting. She did not look at the southwest corner, where the 4th subordinate had failed the cantilever twice. She did not need to. The 3 subordinates oriented around her. She was 12 feet from the wire, and she was looking, again, at the cabin, again, at the porch. Wade thought, as he told me later, "She is looking at the porch because she knows we are on it. That is not anthropomorphism." A grey wolf alpha of mature breeding age has worked humans and human structures her entire life. She knows the difference between a lit window and a dark porch. She knows the difference between an empty porch and a porch with 2 men on it. She had not known on the previous nights because the previous nights they had not been on the porch. Tonight she knew. She held the look for what Wade later said felt like 5 minutes and was probably 90 seconds. Joseph held his rifle still. Wade held the Mossberg still. Ranger held her position. None of the 3 men or dog made a sound. The alpha lifted her head. She made a single low sound, not a howl, not a bark, something closer to a long vowel call held at the throat. The 3 subordinates at the corner came in tight around her. The 4th subordinate came around from the southwest at a trot to join them. The 5 animals formed up. The alpha turned. The pack went uphill at the deliberate walk it had used on every night it had come down, and they were inside the timber within 90 seconds. The bench was empty. Wade and Joseph held position on the porch for another hour. Ranger held with them. At 1:45, Joseph stood up slow and rubbed his right knee where it had stiffened on the porch boards, and he said, "They will not come tomorrow." Wade said, "How do you know?" Joseph said, "She called them off. When she calls them off after a test of the wire, they do not come the next night. They go and they hunt elsewhere. They will come again, but not this week. Maybe not this season. Maybe not until the next time they have a new young animal who needs to be taught about wire." Wade said, "How did your grandfather know that?" Joseph said, "He sat on his porch in 1931, and in 1932, and in 1933. He sat for 21 winters. He learned by sitting." They went inside. Joseph drank one more cup of his own coffee at the kitchen table And then he said he would sleep on the porch in his bedroll because he wanted to wake up where the wind was. Wade said, "All right." Joseph rolled out the bag on the porch under the eave and lay down with the rifle beside him, and Ranger lay down across his boots, which was again a thing Ranger had not done for anyone except Wade. Joseph was asleep inside 3 minutes. Wade lay down on the cot inside. He did not sleep. He listened to the wind. He listened to Ranger's breathing on the porch. At 4 in the morning, he got up and made coffee, and he carried 2 cups out to the porch, and he set one on the boards beside Joseph's head, and Joseph opened his eyes and reached for the cup without sitting up. They drank coffee on the porch in the dark until first light came up over the eastern ridge. At 6:20 in the morning, Levi Renko's white county Ford turned in at the lower gate of the lease. Wade heard it coming up the road. He stood up. Joseph stood up with him. Ranger came off the porch and stood at Wade's left hip and watched the road. Renko parked at the gate of the carving yard. He got out of the Ford. He was carrying a clipboard and a thermos. He walked to the wire on the southeast corner, and he stood there for the better part of a minute, looking at the dig hole the subordinate had left on the 5th night, which Wade had not yet filled in. He looked at the scratched, bright wire at the bottom of the hole where the L-skirt was. He walked around to the southwest corner, and he looked at the spilled back dust where the 4th subordinate had landed on its side from the failed cantilever vault. He looked at the brackets. He looked at the cantilever. He came back to the gate. He looked at Wade. He looked at Joseph. He looked at Ranger. He said, "Joseph." Joseph said, "Levi." Renko said to Wade, "I lost 2 more in the night." Wade said, "Where?" Renko said, "Lower pasture again. Same kill pattern. I had 9 animals at the gate this morning, and a calf gone and a yearling heifer down. The yearling is alive, but she is opened at the hind quarter." Wade said, "I am sorry." Renko said, "I want you to come down to my place on Saturday morning at 7 with that trench jig." Wade said, "I will." Renko said, "I want you to bring whatever wire you have left." Wade said, "I will bring the wire. I will bring the spare brackets. I will bring my excavator if the dealer's man can get it to me by Friday." Renko stood at the gate for another moment, looking at the wire. He said, "You went 36 inches down." Wade said, "I did." Renko said, "And 12 inches sideways." Wade said, "I did." Renko was quiet for a while. He looked at the wire. He looked at the cattle inside the yard. 80 pairs, all of them standing on 4 legs. The cow with the torn hock at the center of the bunch, with her left rear bandaged and her calf at her flank. He looked at the cabin behind the wire, and at the chimney mass coming up through the roof line, and at the porch, and at Joseph standing on the porch, with his coffee cup in his hand, and his rifle leaning against the door frame behind him. Renko said, "Cooper would have helped you build this." Wade said, "He would have." Renko said, "I'm sorry I said what I said in April." Wade said, "It is all right." Renko said, "It is not all right, but thank you for saying so." He stood at the gate a moment longer. Then he got back in the white county Ford, and he drove down the lease road to attend to his yearling heifer. Joseph drank the last of his coffee. He said the one sentence. Wade said, "He said the 2 sentences." Joseph said, "That is a lot of sentences for Levi Renko in one morning." Wade said, "It is." Joseph put his cup on the porch rail. He walked out to his truck. He said over his shoulder, "I will see you Saturday at Levi's place at 7. I will bring the post-pounder." Wade said, "Thank you, Joseph." Joseph drove down the lease road. The dust on the road settled slow behind his truck because there was no wind in the early morning yet. Wade walked back inside the cabin. He took off his coat. He hung the Mossberg on the rack by the door, below the single-action Colt that had not been touched since March. He went to the wall by the south window, and he stood for a moment looking at the small piece of canvas he had pinned there in February, on the first day he had come up to the lease. It was a fragment cut off the corner of a glove. The glove had been Cooper's. The right-hand glove of his last pair of working gloves, the ones he had been wearing in the photograph, Margaret kept on the mantel at the East Rosebud place. The one of Cooper at the gate of this same line cabin in the autumn of 2017, with his right hand on the gatepost and his left hand around a coffee cup. The glove had torn through at the knuckle of the index finger sometime that autumn, and Cooper had taped it back together with white electrical tape and had finished out the season wearing it. Margaret had given the glove to Wade in February at the East Rosebud kitchen table, the day Wade arrived. She had said, "It is what I have." Wade had cut a small square out of the palm and pinned the square to the cabin wall by the south window. He had not told her he had done that. He looked at the piece of canvas, now in the early morning light, and he did not say anything to it. He put his right hand briefly against it. He went out to the calving barn to check on the cow with the torn hock. The cow was standing up. She had stood up sometime in the night on her own. Her calf was nursing. The bandage on her hock was loose at the bottom edge, but the gauze was still in place, and the wound was not bleeding. She looked at Wade when he came into the barn, and she did not move. He walked up to her, and he put his hand on her shoulder, and he stood with her for a minute. Ranger came in and lay down at the door of the barn and watched the south slope. He left the barn open at the south end, so the cow could walk out into the yard if she chose to. She did, at 9 in the morning. He saw her go from the porch. She walked out into the sun, and she stood by the gate of the yard with her calf at her flank, and she stayed there for the better part of an hour. The other 79 pairs grazed around her in the dry grass inside the wire. Wade and Ranger walked the perimeter of the yard at 10. They counted the cattle. 250 pairs, one cow with a sutured hock, no losses. The pack had come for 6 nights, and the wire and the dog and the man had held the yard, and the pack had gone home, and the alpha had called them off. Dr. Stratton came up from Absorky at noon. He sutured the cow's hock at 4 stitches and gave her a course of penicillin. He stood at the gate after he was finished, and he looked at the wire, and he said, "This is the only operation on this drainage that did not lose stock this week, Wade." Wade said he knew. Stratton said, "How did you know to do the L skirt?" Wade said, "I knew a man whose grandfather did it on the Big Horn in 1931. Stratton said, "Joseph Plain Bull." Wade said, "Yes." Stratton said, "He should be writing this down." Wade said, "He says he is." Stratton drove down the lease road. Wade and Ranger went back to the porch. The afternoon settled. The dust on the road settled. The wind came up at 3 and moved across the bench from the southwest, and the smell of dry sage and dry bunchgrass came up with it, and the cattle moved with it slow around the inside of the wire, and there was no other sound at all. I will tell you what the rest of that fall was. The pack did not come back. The state predator officer confirmed the kill on Renko's yearling heifer, and the federal compensation paperwork went in on the 22nd of September. On the 28th, Wade and Renko and Joseph dug the trench around Renko's lower calving pasture, 490 feet of L-skirt at 36 inches with 12-inch outward kick, in 3 working days with the rented mini excavator and Joseph's post-pounder and Renko's 2 hired hands. Wade did not charge Renko for the labor. Renko paid for the wire. Joseph cooked the suppers. They finished the cantilever brackets on the 3rd afternoon. Ranger lay at the line of the work the entire 3 days and watched the timber edge to the south, and the wolves did not come down to the timber edge while she was watching. Margaret came up to the lease on the second Sunday of October with another casserole. She walked the inside of the yard with Wade and Ranger, and she stood at the southeast corner where the dig hole had been filled in and tamped. She said, "Cooper would have liked this." Wade said, "I think he would." She said, "I'm glad you came up." Wade said, "So am I." She stayed for the afternoon. She drove down the drainage at sundown. The lease ran out on the 17th of October. The cattle came off on the 18th and the 19th, trucked back to the feeder yard in Belgrade for finishing. The 80 pairs out of the calving yard came off last. The cow with the sutured hock walked up the ramp into the trailer on her own 4 legs. Wade closed up the cabin on the 23rd. He pulled the lamp wicks. He banked the cookstove cold. He covered the cot with a wool blanket. He hung the Mossberg on the wall rack inside its case. He did not take down the piece of canvas pinned by the south window. He drove down the lease road with Ranger on the seat beside him. He drove to the East Rosebud. He spent the winter at Margaret's place in the spare bedroom that had been Cooper's office, and he ran the herd for her on the bottomland through the cold months. Margaret signed the lease over to him on the 11th of December. He did not ask her to. She did it because Cooper had told her to do it, in October of 2017, in the same week he had told her what he wanted Wade to be doing. She had been carrying that arrangement for 10 months. She told Wade on the day she signed, and she did not explain it further, and Wade did not ask her to. Wade is still on that lease. Ranger is still on the lease with him. The yard is in its 7th season now, as I record this. The L skirt is intact. The cantilever has held. The pack has come down off the bench on 3 other occasions in that span, and the wire has held each time. Joseph Plain Bull walks up the lease road every other Sunday and sits at the kitchen table with a thermos of his own coffee. Margaret Hollis comes up most Sundays of the calving season. If you have stayed with this account this long, I will ask one small thing, and I will ask it once. There is a particular kind of knowledge that gets carried up dirt roads in the linings of jackets and in the pencil margins of small leather notebooks, and in what one grandfather knew about wolves on horses in 1931. The men who carry it are not many. They are leaving us. If this channel does what I want it to do, we will get a few more of these accounts into the record before they go. If that is the kind of work you find a place